The CIA is known to have conducted some strange and very secretive operations through the years, most of which the public never knew about. But as files on these operations are declassified, we become privy to their details, and some of the facts that they contain are not only fascinating, but in some cases truly bizarre. Number 10. When Osama bin Laden was still alive, he was declared by then-President of the United States, Bill Clinton, as public enemy number 1, and plans were put into place for him to be found and brought to justice. His life was ended on the 2nd of May 2011 when he was tracked down in Pakistan, where he'd been hiding out for years. But before this took place, the CIA had taken a vested interest in his activities and had hatched a plan to taint his reputation abroad. But to do so, they had to think very creatively, since any direct propaganda against him may have caused these very people to turn against the United States. The main targets of this plan, which was called Operation Devil Eyes, were foreign children that had not been fully tainted by bin Laden's ideals, in hopes that they would learn of his true nature before deciding to turn against the US. Since most children have very little interest in politics and war, it was decided that they could be swayed by a toy that would change over time to change their opinion of the dangerous and oppressive leader. It was decided that the best way to do this was with a toy, specifically a doll or action figure of bin Laden that stood about 12 inches high. It was meant to be a very close likeness to the man himself, but it had a hidden surprise that would not be detected until the toy had been played with for some time. The CIA took advice from a former executive of the Hasbro toy company, Donald Levine, and when he learned about the plan, he started making arrangements for the doll to be produced by factories based in Japan. What made the doll unique was the fact that a heat-dissolving paint was used to create its facial features, and as time went on and children played with it, the top layer of paint would gradually wear off, revealing a terrifying demon-like face underneath. Prototypes of the doll showed that the demon face was closely based on that of the famous Star Wars character Darth Maul, who first appeared in the film Episode 1: The Phantom Menace. It would also have come complete with a white turban, a white buttoned robe, a pair of pants, and black shoes. 3 prototypes were eventually manufactured, but before mass production could begin, the agency had second thoughts and decided to pull the plug on the entire operation. But according to some sources, a few hundred of the dolls were made and shipped to Pakistan in 2006. Of the 3 prototypes, one was kept by the CIA, while the other was given to Levine. He passed away in 2014, after which his estate decided to put it up for auction. Bidding on the doll was fierce, and in the end it sold for $11,879. Number 9. When the Second World War ended, most people were relieved that the long and brutal conflict had finally come to an end. But unbeknownst to them, another was just starting in the form of the Cold War. The US learned that the Soviet Union had somehow gotten their hands on some of their documents, and using these had started developing atomic weapons, which understandably caused a lot of tension between the two powers. The US government started looking for ways to gather intelligence on the Soviet Union, and to do so, the CIA put into motion Operation Gold, during which the communications between France, Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union would be secretly monitored. But this was preceded by a British plan, Operation Silver, which saw an agent called Peter Lunn investigating the Soviet Union. He discovered that they were making use of Austrian phone lines to communicate between the Vienna military headquarters and Moscow, and that these lines were being routed through the Hotel Imperial in Vienna. With the operation now in full swing, the British Secret Service decided to buy a nearby building, after which they paved it with reinforced concrete and started digging a tunnel to the cables running to the hotel. The building was disguised as the Harris Tweed Import Company, and to MI6's surprise, the business did rather well, affording workers underground to continue their task unnoticed by either the public or the Soviet military. They were eventually able to complete the 70-foot tunnel and tap the communication cables in question, and over time they started sharing the information they had gleaned with the US, specifically the CIA. They were able to stay ahead of their battle tactics and any plans that were being put in place in Moscow. The operation ended in 1952 and paved the way for Operation Gold, which employed a similar strategy. In July of 1945, Berlin was divided following the end of the Second World War, and so the US military established a headquarters in the city, immediately next to a zone that was being controlled by the British. By this time, the Soviet Union had stepped up their efforts to spy on the US by any means necessary, and knowing this, the CIA started their own operations in the city, under the cover name Berlin Operating Base, or BOB. They started secret intelligence and counterintelligence operations at this time, and learned as much as they could about the economic climate of Soviet-controlled areas of the city, but more importantly, discovered that they had started mining for uranium, which was one of the most important elements in the construction of an atomic bomb. With this new threat now being exposed, the CIA needed intelligence more than ever, and they started hatching a plan similar to Operation Silver to tap the communication cables beneath Berlin. As soon as their plans improved, digging started. To hide its true purpose, the digging was disguised as the construction of an Air Force radar, an accompanying warehouse, and to everyone's surprise, the Soviets took no real interest. But a problem soon arose. When the CIA decided to inform the British of their operations, a double agent named George Blake took as many notes as he could and immediately relayed all this information to his superior. Nevertheless, construction of the tunnel went ahead, and by February of 1955, the 500-yard tunnel was completed. They'd reached the main Soviet switching cable facility, and 3 months later, the first taps were attached. When the operation was said and done, the CIA had listened in on more than 40,000 hours of phone calls and amassed more than 1,750 intelligence reports. When the heavy rains hit the area in April of 1956, some of the wires were exposed and the tunnels were discovered, causing agents to flee. But by all accounts, the operation was a success, and today it's still considered to be one of the CIA's most audacious undertakings. Number 8. The CIA was heavily relied upon during the Cold War, but much of their work at this time had to be done in complete secrecy. This meant they had to employ some unusual tactics to deceive their opposition, and in one case they recruited a magician to author a manual on deception and trickery. The magician in question was a man named John Mulholland, who had perfected the art of sleight of hand and illusions in New York's Martinka magic shop. They offered him a total of $3,000 to write the book, which he readily accepted. Surprisingly, the manual directs agents on how to smuggle one of their own out of a foreign and hostile country, how to send messages to one another using their shoelaces, and how to make people seemingly disappear into thin air. It would later come to light that the manual was written as part of the controversial MK-Ultra project, which delved into the possibilities of mind control. The guide was codenamed MK-Ultra Subproject No. 4, and was later described by master magician Lance Burton as a James Bond meets Harry Houdini textbook. The chapter on sleight of hand explains that a small gesture can easily go unnoticed if it's disguised by another grander gesture that to the observer has an obvious purpose. This allowed agents to slip small objects into their pockets unnoticed, or to dispose of evidence without being caught. But the manual had many more tricks to teach. One of these explained that an agent could apply wax to the bottom of his briefcase, which would allow him to place it on top of important papers that would then stick to the wax when he would pick it up again. He could then walk away with the papers without anyone being any the wiser. He also made reference to the famous trick where magicians seemingly saw their assistants in half and explained that in reality there are two people in the box and it was just an illusion. He added that this same trick could be used by agents if they were to place a secret compartment in a vehicle, after which they could smuggle anyone out of a dangerous situation without being exposed. He also advised that when an agent is in a difficult situation, they could tear or dirty their clothes to look more disheveled, thereby attracting less attention. They could also lace or tie their shoelaces in a certain way to relay messages to fellow agents without the need to communicate verbally. Another suggestion was for agents to sew pockets into their pants so that they could surreptitiously hide weapons or sensitive documents without drawing suspicion, especially if the document was folded 4 times, making it easy to retrieve and quickly pass to a fellow agent via a handshake. Some of Mulholland's other tricks included hiding small caliber ammunition in toothpaste, concealing intelligence in cigarette packets, storing poisoned pills and matchbooks in case they needed to be used against an enemy, or using a hollowed-out coin to hide important notes. Number 7. When it came to staying ahead of their enemies as far as espionage and trickery were concerned, the CIA often employed or considered using tactics that, under any other circumstance, would seem like something out of a cartoon or children's spy storybook. One such invention that was tested, but never actually used in the field, was an inflatable airplane that, according to the agency, could serve agents that were in trouble in several ways. If they found themselves stranded in enemy territory and needed to make a quick getaway, they could call for one of these planes to be dropped near their location. It could then be inflated by adding water to specifically designed tablets that would release gas, and the agent could then climb aboard before starting up the engine and fleeing. Another version of the plane used the craft's own engine to inflate it. If an agent was stranded on a large body of water, it would double as an inflatable raft, or could be launched as a plane directly from the water if the circumstances allowed it. One agent that was involved with the plane's development later stated that the design was thoroughly tested and found to be viable, but because of what he refers to as politics, the devices were never released for actual use. He added that on one occasion, an agent needed a similar way of being extracted, and when he went to the CIA's secret warehouse to retrieve the plane, it had been in storage for so long that it had started to disintegrate, and since no other prototypes remained, it was no longer a viable option. Another inflatable device that was considered was an inflatable doll that could be used to distract enemies while an agent was being pursued. The dolls were proposed during the Cold War, and the CIA employed Hollywood makeup artist John Chambers to develop them. The CIA was facing a problem in the Soviet Union, since nearly all of their agents had a KGB agent following them wherever they went. This made it hard for them to meet up with fellow agents or to relay information to their superiors, so they needed to come up with a way of distracting their stalkers. Chambers had worked with the CIA before, helping them smuggle American citizens out of Iran by creating a fake movie studio and fake sci-fi movie, and on that occasion the plan worked without a hitch. One way that these dolls could be used was when an agent was being followed while he was driving. The doll would be kept in a normal-looking suitcase, and as the agent approached a sharp corner, they would suddenly speed up. Once they had turned the corner and were out of sight for a few seconds, they would open the briefcase and jump out of the vehicle. The doll would pop up out of the suitcase and give the impression that the agent was still in the car, while in reality he was already heading down the road unnoticed. The prototypes that were created were called Jack-in-the-Box dummies, and according to those who tested them, they worked just as they intended to. This was just another way in which the CIA used misdirection to fool their enemies and add an extra level of security to the already dangerous jobs that their agents were doing. Number 6. It's no secret that the CIA had a serious problem with Fidel Castro, since he was seen as a Soviet client that posed a serious threat to the US, and while they were all unsuccessful, the agency attempted to have him assassinated more than 600 times, often by some very unconventional and almost comedic means. One of the most famous of these attempts was to either poison his beloved cigars or to place explosives inside of them without his knowledge. The poison plot went ahead when an agent was given one of Castro's boxes of cigars, and he tainted them with an incredibly powerful toxin. But when the cigars were sent to Castro, they were first handed to an unknown person who may or may not have ended up losing their life instead, since they were never delivered to Castro. Another plot involved Castro's love interest, Marita Lorenz, who was tasked by the CIA to slip poison pills into his food or drink. She traveled to Havana to enact the plan, but as soon as she arrived, she started getting cold feet. It's now known that even if she hadn't decided to abandon the plan, it wouldn't have worked anyway, because she'd hidden the pills in a jar of cold cream, and when she tried to retrieve them, she found that they'd all disintegrated, so she ended up flushing the pills down a toilet. In the 1960s, another assassination plot was developed when it was suggested that Castro be poisoned with the use of a pen. A Cuban official, who's only known by the name AM/Lash, was given a pen containing a hidden hypodermic needle. It's said that the needle was so thin that Castro would not have even noticed being pierced by it. But the official found this plan so laughable that he told the CIA to come up with something better, since they surely had the resources to develop something more foolproof. However, this was by no means the most bizarre of the assassination attempts against the dictator. It became known to the CIA that he seemed to have a strange obsession with milk and other dairy products. In fact, he was so fond of them that he would eat at least 18 spoonfuls of ice cream with his breakfast every morning. Throughout the day, he would drink several milkshakes, and on top of that, drink many glasses of milk and consume other dairy products. He ordered a huge ice cream parlor to be built in Havana, where he and members of the public could acquire different flavors of ice cream. This gave the CIA yet another opportunity at an assassination attempt, and the decision was made to poison the ice cream that was used to make his milkshakes. A poisoned pill was placed in the ice cream freezer and would be retrieved by an agent while the drink was being prepared, after which he would simply slip it into the glass. But when he arrived at the freezer, he realized the pill had frozen solid to the freezer wall, and he was unable to pry it loose without breaking it into pieces. The attempt was an unmitigated failure, but the CIA didn't give up on trying to end Castro's life, further devising plans that included sprinkling powder into his shoes that would cause his beard to fall out, placing explosives near his favorite fishing spots, and even attacking him while he was attending a baseball game. But none of these attempts worked, and Castro lived to the ripe old age of 90. Number 5. One would imagine that being a CIA agent means constantly having your wits about you and being trained in all matters of deception and misdirection. But this doesn't necessarily translate to informants that are employed by the agency, as is evidenced by a case that occurred in 2011 in the Middle East. The incident involved agents who were working for the US in Lebanon and Iran. These agents were part of two separate spying operations. The first was tasked with infiltrating and extracting information on the Beirut-based militant group called Hezbollah, while the other was attempting to learn as much as possible about a nuclear program that was being developed in Iran. The two spy groups would meet up with their handlers on occasion to exchange information and discuss their future plans. And to do so, they would travel to a Pizza Hut restaurant in Beirut, where they would have a meal and compare notes. But their handlers had made one fatal mistake. Whenever they discussed the date for the next meeting, they would quite unbelievably use the code word pizza, which is considered by many to be the weakest code word the agency has ever used. Furthermore, counterintelligence agents from Hezbollah had noticed that certain cell phones that were being used in Beirut would only be switched on very rarely, and when they were always used in the same locations. They were active for just a short while before being turned off again, understandably raising suspicion among Hezbollah members. The group started an investigation, and when they realized that agents were using the pizza code word, they concluded that agents were meeting at the Pizza Hut restaurant. Two double agents confirmed this location while pretending to be working for the CIA, and unsurprisingly, two of the agents were taken into custody. News of their apprehension was sent to the US, but the US Embassy denied that this ever happened and refuted the claims that agents were meeting in a Pizza Hut restaurant. But US officials later had no choice but to admit that as many as a dozen spies had been ousted, and the CIA's efforts to gather intelligence on the Iranian nuclear program had been dealt a severe blow. The discovery of these agents also meant that it would now be harder for the US to recruit spies in the Middle East, since suspicions were higher than ever, and anyone who decided to work for the agency would be risking their lives. In a broadcast that was aired after the agents were apprehended, members of the group claimed that CIA agents also met at a local Starbucks and a McDonald's restaurant at times, and added that they had taken photos of these agents that were then shared with Hezbollah allies in Iran. The group's leader claimed that two Hezbollah members had been interrogated and then admitted that they were working as spies for the CIA. But this was by no means the first time that the agency had a setback in its Middle Eastern operations. In 2010, the names of two CIA station chiefs based in Pakistan had their names revealed in that country's media, and they had to be extracted from Islamabad before they could be located by their enemies. While the agency has also seen a lot of success in the region by disrupting and sabotaging the country's nuclear program, for example, this incident undoubtedly caused a massive setback that'll take the CIA years to recover from. Number 4. When it comes to psychological operations, better known as PSYOPs, most of us think of secret operations that involve mind control experiments, propaganda campaigns, the dissemination of information, and other activities that are tailored to any psychological vulnerabilities within a specific targeted group. Most of these types of campaigns take place behind closed doors and are not generally known to the public, but it's been suggested that during the Cold War, the CIA decided to try and use art, a medium that everyone is familiar with, in an effort to showcase the American ideal of freedom and creativity, which was the exact opposite of what was happening in the Soviet Union at the time. This operation didn't make use of just any art technique, but focused solely on a particular style. As soon as the Second World War ended, artists that had been struggling for years suddenly started seeing success, and they banded together to name this new movement Abstract Expressionism. At first, this style of painting and sculpture confused most of the public, thanks to its hectic and sometimes chaotic imagery. But before long, it started taking the world by storm and brought some of history's most prominent artists into the spotlight. The style first spread through New York and Paris, and by the 1950s, it had become an accepted and appreciated art style. The first of these artists to rise to fame were Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, Mark Rothko, and Clayford Still, whose paintings are still sought after today. Pollock passed away in a car crash in 1956, and a year later one of his paintings was sold to the Metropolitan Museum for $30,000. This might not seem like much when it comes to art pieces, but since he was still a contemporary, it was an unprecedented amount of money. With abstract expressionism now widely accepted around the world, the New American Painting exhibition, organized by the New York Museum of Art, started a tour of major European cities such as Paris, Milan, Berlin, and of course London. But the art form's popularity was soon under threat. In the early part of the 60s, pop art started emerging, and many art lovers started moving away from abstract expressionism, as rumors started to swirl that the latter was an invention of the US government. Many people felt that its rise to prominence was too swift, and that the CIA in particular was using these paintings as a kind of benevolent propaganda to turn the public into oppressed countries against their leaders by showing them what freedom really looked like. Pollock was described on at least one occasion as, quote, a rotten rebel from Russia, while David Anfum, the curator of the Royal Academy exhibition, stated that other artists had called Pollock an anarchist. These rumors only grew when it came to light, thanks to an article in the New York Times, that the CIA had been funding an anti-communist magazine called Encounter. People started to speculate that Pollock and his fellow visionaries had all been used by the CIA, whether they knew it or not, to promote their own ideals and agenda to people in foreign countries. When it came to light that exhibitions were being bankrolled by influential and affluent people who had close ties to the CIA, many more people started to believe that the CIA was responsible for the emergence of abstract expressionism. And according to some, this is the reason why so much of our art in modern days is considered to be subpar. Number 3. On the 12th of April, 1961, the Soviet Union reached a milestone that very quickly propelled their space program forward when they sent cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin into space in the Vostok 1 spacecraft, which then also achieved successful orbit around the Earth, becoming the first ever to do so. But the US followed hot on their heels when they sent John Glenn into space in the Friendship 7 spacecraft during the Mercury Atlas 6 space mission. While the US had lost the space race to the Soviet Union, it was still considered a massive feat, but not many people are aware that the CIA had a secret plan just in case this mission turned out to be a failure. The months and weeks leading up to Glenn's flight were tense to say the least, since the US was still reeling from the fact that the Soviets made it to space first. While everything had been done to ensure Mercury Atlas 6's success, this was unexplored territory, and there was always the chance that the mission would fail. If this were to happen, the US knew that it would result in a major setback in the American space program, and so they decided to look for a scapegoat beforehand, just in case everything didn't quite go to plan. The plan was a part of the CIA's Operation Mongoose, which was aimed at removing Fidel Castro from his position in power in Cuba via a revolution. The plan to blame him if Glenn's flight was unsuccessful was dubbed Operation Dirty Trick. It was carried out in secret, but thanks to documents that were declassified in the 1990s, We now know that the US Department of Defense first employed a strategy called Operation Cover-Up, during which they tried to convince Cuba that they were using the space program as a cover for something entirely different, though they never revealed what the cover was for, since it wasn't necessary and not true. As for Operation Dirty Trick, it was decided beforehand that certain pieces of evidence would be manufactured, that upon Mercury Atlas 6 failing would serve as proof that Cuba had somehow managed to electronically interfere with the craft, and that the US was in no way responsible for the mission not being completed. But this was only one way in which the US looked to discredit Cuba and Castro in particular. At one stage, they considered a plan called Operation Good Time, which entailed creating a photograph of an obese Castro, along with two beautiful women sitting at a table that's laden with all sorts of luxurious food items. The photo would be spread among the public with the caption, "My portion is different," in an effort to make it seem as though their leader was living in luxury, while the average person in Cuba was struggling to make ends meet, and in some cases couldn't even feed themselves. Number 2. One of the most prominent conspiracy theories today is the suggestion that the governments of the world have for decades had the technology to modify the planet's weather at will, and that this strategy has been used on many different occasions for different reasons. It's now a known fact that the CIA once played a part in a plan called Operation Popeye, which was hinged on the research conducted by chemist Vincent Schaefer, who in 1946 started experimenting with cloud seeding and saw success. Schaefer had noticed that cloud condensation nuclei were responsible for the condensation of water in a cloud, and he believed that these nuclei could be produced artificially. He started experimenting with the idea and started seeding clouds in Berkshire, Massachusetts, after which he was able to successfully produce artificial rain. With this success came all kinds of suggestions as to how this technology could be used. Some people proposed that it could bring much-needed rain to drought-stricken areas, or that it could help revive failing crops all over the world. But the US government had other plans. In the midst of the Vietnam War, US forces became aware that during the months of May and October every year, the country went through its annual monsoon season, which caused a real problem for Vietnamese troops, since it almost always caused flooding, landslides, and made parts of the jungle completely impassable at times. But in March of 1967, the rain was still at least a month away, and so Operation Popeye was started. Pilots were told to fly over pre-selected areas of the country, armed with canisters of silver iodide that would help increase the amount of nuclei in the clouds. When the plane reached the intended target, the canisters would be lit and dumped, causing them to release smoke-containing particles into the clouds. This would cause far more rain than usual to fall in any desired areas, making it hard for Vietnamese troops to fulfill their duties and cover certain areas that were now made inaccessible. By all accounts, the operation was a success, but not everyone was impressed by the fact that it had been kept a secret from the American public, including Senator Claiborne Pell. When he and Senator Clifford P. Case were being briefed on the success of the operation, he grew ever more irritated with the fact that US taxpayers funded the effort that cost them $3.6 million a year. He also wasn't convinced that the operation was as successful as the CIA claimed, since the results were unverifiable, and he argued that if it had been successful, the results were clearly limited. Furthermore, he felt that it was unnecessary for the government to keep the operation a secret, and asked that if he wasn't aware of what was being done, what other secrets were there that he was not informed of? Hence, Operation Popeye was revealed to the public a few months later, leaving many people worried about what the future implications of such technology would be. In modern times, cloud seeding is used to prolong favorable skiing conditions in some areas after snow had stopped falling naturally, and to provide drought-stricken areas with at least some rainfall. Number 1. At the mere mention of the CIA, many people think of the many assassinations, whether successful or not, that the agency has carried out since it was founded in 1947. One such attempt was made on the life of Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo. At the time, the CIA was under the impression that Lumumba was in cahoots with the Soviet Union, and the decision was made that he had to be assassinated. He'd started demanding that independence be restored to the Congolese people, but the CIA wanted him removed from the office and ultimately done away with. The Congo was still under Belgian rule at the time, and so the agency started tapping the phones of Colonel Joseph Mobutu, who was known to have close ties to Belgian intelligence, in order to gather as much intel as possible. One of these plans seemed so absurd that it's hard to believe. The CIA had kept in contact with 2 hitmen that they had used in the past. They hailed from Europe and were known to be career criminals who would have no qualms with following through with an assassination. One of these men was given a tube of toothpaste, presumably the same brand that Lumumba used, and was then told to poison it before ensuring that it somehow ended up in the leader's possession. The plan came about when Dr. Ewan Cameron was asked to take a closer look at Lumumba and his lifestyle, and while doing so, he noticed that he had immaculately white teeth, leading him to conclude that he had an extensive dental routine. Since it was certain that he used toothpaste at least on a daily basis, poisoning the tube of the product seemed like the best way to ensure that he ingested the added substance, and that this would lead to his life being ended. But Lumumba was under the protection of the UN at the time, while being guarded in his house, and it was decided that having him assassinated at that time would be a terrible idea, since it would almost certainly have tainted the US's reputation. But John F. Kennedy was on the cusp of being inaugurated as president, and the CIA decided that something had to be done about Lumumba right away. They arranged to have him flown to the Congo on a chartered plane. While this may not seem like much of a compromise, it should be noted that he was flown to Katanga, a section of the Congo that was under the control of hostile factions that deeply opposed Lumumba's ideals, and that would have relished at the chance of getting their hands on him. CIA Station Chief James Devlin was involved in this arrangement, and later stated that as soon as Lumumba was sent to Katanga, it was generally accepted that his time in power had come to an end, and that he would not be able to survive for very long. Before the plane had even reached its destination, Lumumba was attacked and badly assaulted. Upon landing, he was forced into a jeep and driven to a farm where he was once again attacked by his rivals, who, according to the CIA, were tied to US intelligence. In the end, it was not the poisoned toothpaste that claimed his life, but there's no doubt that the CIA had a hand in Lumumba's demise, and that they had accomplished their goal, even if it wasn't done as originally planned. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.